Mary Audrey Blackford, born 1903, Shenandoah Junction, West Virginia. Mary Bowman College Class, 1927. Married orchardist James A. Higgs, 4 sons, 1 daughter, died 1981, age 77. That's the chronology, but I'd like to share with you the Audrey Higgs that I knew. I met Audrey Higgs in July 1976. I was 24 years old, had just gotten out of the Marine Corps and spent about a year kicking around the country, trying to get the last 4 years out of my system. But I wanted to be a writer, so I came back home to Staunton to kind of settle down and apply myself to the task. And I landed in a rooming house at 108 Church Street. And my life would never be the same. This house was owned and overseen by what I thought was just the sweetest little old lady. She was a widow, she was articulate, she had bridge games for her friends, and she enjoyed good music and art and literature. But little did I know that beneath Audrey Higgs' mane of snow-white hair and behind those sharp blue eyes and beyond the broad smile that she flashed so easily, lay a hell-raising revolutionary of the first water. Now, we both smoked in those days. She in her 70s smoked cigars. I in my 20s smoked cigarettes, and we spent countless hours sitting around her kitchen, in her living room, on her front porch, on her back porch, talking about every conceivable topic. And it was during these conversations over the next few years that I discovered this was not your typical sweet little old lady running a rooming house. One of the things I discovered was that she was a passionate advocate of the rights of mental patients, and she worked throughout much of her adult life for mental health reform. She called it my longest and saddest struggle. As a visiting church worker at Western State Hospital in the 1930s, she saw that a great many of the patients didn't really need to be there. They were essentially social outcasts. They had been placed there for a matter of convenience by family or whomever. And these were people she felt with a little help could return to society, to a productive life. And they didn't have anybody until she came along. Thus began her campaign to free those whose mental health would allow it. It was a very tough thing to extract these people from the hospital, she told me, because the rule was that only the person who had put them in could get them out. So she went to the people who had put them in. She went to the family members. She went to whoever had had a hand in this and worked to get some of these patients out, the ones whose mental health would allow it. Once she got them out, she found them jobs. She found them a place to live. And an interesting thing was going on during all of this. The administration at the hospital at the time disliked her intensely. They felt she was a meddling outsider, that she was sticking her nose where it didn't belong. What does she know about this? She's just causing trouble. So they began to throw roadblocks in her way. At one point, they even said, "You can't come here and visit these patients." And she said, "Nonsense. I'm a taxpayer. I'm paying your salary. I'll come over there if I want to." And she did. And they couldn't stop her. So they tried to throw up legal roadblocks. So she got a lawyer. And she went to court. And the process was sometimes agonizingly slow. She told me that one time it took 3 years to extract one patient from the hospital. But she did it. And something else very interesting was going on at this time. She said that the patients she visited came to her and said, "We are afraid for you." She said they were afraid the hospital authorities would come and get her and put her in there because she was causing so much trouble for them. The danger was very real, she said. In those days, it was easy to get committed, and I was on highly unfavorable terms with the entire hospital. So as a countermeasure, she got in a car with a friend, drove to Washington, D.C., to the Justice Department, had an interview with somebody up there, told them what was going on, and she came away with a phone number that either she or her family could call if, indeed, they came to get her. Her efforts over the years were received with positive attention from the likes of Eleanor Roosevelt, Joan Crawford. And later in life, when age and disability slowed her activism, she was honored with a commendation from the Staunton, Western Augusta County Mental Health Association. And about all of this, she just said, well, I'm glad I helped a few to freedom. And during these many conversations we had, I also found out that she was a passionate feminist, almost to the point of militancy. In fact, it's my personal belief that the only thing that stopped Audrey Higgs from marching on somebody or something was the arthritis that made walking for her a little difficult. She was outspoken about equal rights for women. She wrote letters and campaigned for passage of an equal rights amendment. And she worked diligently for the protection of abused women. She brought them into her home. She stood up to their abusive and bullying husbands, backed them down. So I'm not going to show fear. And she didn't. And whenever she could, she financially contributed to groups that supported her causes. Not everybody agreed with Audrey Higgs and her views on equal rights for women, sometimes family members. I remember there was a visit by one of her sisters. And I was upstairs in my room one day, probably this Saturday, writing something. And I heard this huge row going on down in the living room. So I came downstairs, and there's Mrs. Higgs and her sister just hammer and tongs. This is a huge fight. And so I said, what is going on here? And so apparently what had happened was her sister came into the room and saw a copy of Ms. Magazine lying on a coffee table or something and said something to the effect of, Audrey, get that piece of trash out of here. Well, the gauntlet was down. And Audrey Higgs never let a gauntlet lay in front of her very long. She picked it up, and thus began the great centenarian battle. So after I found this out, I said, you know something? I said, I've had to separate a lot of drunks in my day, but I've never had to separate two Christian ladies. This is the first time. Well, they laughed about it, and they went to their separate corners, but I don't think they ever did see eye to eye, at least on the Ms. Magazine thing. The problem with a life like Audrey Higgs is that it was too big and it touched too many people to encapsulate effectively in just a short span of time. She was a long-time member and frequent president of the Staunton Women's Club. She was an active member of the First Presbyterian Church. She was a freelance writer, wrote for magazines. She hosted inner-city children at her homes, children who'd never been out of the congestion and the crime of the city. She brought home and showed them what a real community was like. And as we have seen, she authored a book about one of her real-life heroes, Queen Elizabeth Miller. She was warm and witty and gentle, yet strong, and had the biggest heart of anybody I've ever known. But when she died, I thought I'd die too. Because despite the nearly half-century in our ages, she was the best friend I had, and the best I'd ever had. A couple of years before she died, I made a promise to her, and I didn't keep that promise. And for almost 17 full years after her death, it bugged me. Almost a week didn't go by when I didn't think about it at least once. Well, in October '97, I wrote a column for the Staunton paper, and if you've got about another 3 or 4 minutes, I'd like to read it to you. It's called Sugar's Obit. She settled into the slightly worn cushions of the sofa, snapped open a Zippo lighter, and fired up a fat old 10-cent cigar. Her thick shock of white hair was smooshed up a little on one side, indicating she just rolled out of bed, but her face was sharp and alert. Charlie, she said, punctuating the air with a cigar, I want you to write my obituary. Well, at 75, Audrey Blackford Higgs had no intention of going anywhere anytime soon. She was, however, a pragmatist, with her piercing blue eyes trained equally on the present and on the inevitable. I despise those obituaries in the paper, she said. Blah, 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 born when the church died. I want you to write my obituary. Well, why me? Well, to Audrey Higgs, it was a perfectly natural request. I was more than just a writer, renting a $25 a week room in her 108 Church Street home. I was a writer she had put on the path to authordom. In 1976, she'd written to the publisher of what was then the Staunton Leader and said, I have a young man living here who writes all the time. He wrote back and said, send him down with samples of his work, and thus began my career as a paid writer. So here I was, her protege, her friend, and very nearly her adopted grandson. A young man who had sat up with her until the wee hours of many mornings discussing everything from politics and literature to religion and the incredible events of her long and varied life. I want you to write my obituary, and I want you to make it interesting, she said, and blew a stream of smoke toward the ceiling. Well, of course I agreed. But when she died on February the 26th, 1981, the editor of the paper told me that death notices had to strictly conform to the dry and static style we see on the obituary page every day. I didn't know that obituaries could be bought, that you could say whatever you wanted to say, and the editor was either too busy or didn't care enough to clue me in. As a consequence, Audrey Higgs got the blah obituary she had specifically wanted to avoid. It didn't mention her driving passion to save the world or to take on the establishment, force it to do the right thing. It said nothing about how she set out to reform mental health care and how her efforts were so hated by officials at the hospital that she had to get Justice Department protection. It didn't say anything about her dedication continued, even after a former mental patient rooming at her house tried to stab her to death. There wasn't a word in that obituary about a young woman growing up in a patriarchal society, struggling to gain equality for women. Nothing was said about her career as a magazine writer or about the book she published, The Royal Queen Elizabeth Miller. Her passion for historic preservation and her contribution to the restoration of the Sears house were completely ignored. And of course, nothing was said about how she loved to light up a cigar during bridge games just for the shock value it had. Or her affection for a noisy, well-attended, slightly rowdy family get-together, of which I was a part sometimes. Or how she avoided appellations such as grandma, grandmother, and worst of all, granny, by insisting that she be called Sugar. I'm as sweet as sugar, she told her family, and that's what you can call me. And finally, the 6-column inches of her obituary made no mention of the dozens of people she had rented rooms to throughout her widowhood. Mechanics and waitresses, nurses and house painters, artists and gas station attendants, and a struggling young wannabe writer, fresh out of the Marine Corps, whom she encouraged, argued with, and said she would always watch over as a guardian angel. Well, if she's still watching, and I suspect she is, this one's for you, Sugar. I can just see her up there now, flicking the ashes off a nice big Corona, saying, thanks, Charlie. That's a bit more like it. Thank you. Everybody has agreed to answer questions if there are any, so the floor is open.